Good, how are you?
I want to welcome you all here to this wonderful lecture series, the Women Who Inspire lecture series. It's become quite a tradition here at SAIS, and we have had a wonderful experience as we come up on our near 10th anniversary of this program, of having an incredible group of women who have played exciting and leading roles in a number of different spheres, from the arts to public affairs, and of course under the inspiration and auspices of my good friend and colleague, Condoleezza, who played a central role in helping to make this come about. And I'm especially pleased to be here to be able to introduce today's speaker and our host, Ambassador Shirin. Our speaker today is Dame Louise Richardson, who is the president of the Carnegie Corporation, which is an extraordinary institution, about which I'll say a word or two in a minute, but I want to begin by saying something about Dame Richardson, who has had an extraordinary career as a leading thinker and an academic leader over many, many decades. She has spent her career dealing with some of the most challenging issues of our time, as an academic, and a 20-year career at Harvard University, working on issues of terrorism and conflict, and writing some of the most insightful and influential pieces that we as academics and practitioners both continue to rely on today. But she has also served in incredibly important leadership roles in the academy, most recently as, for the last 7 years, as the head of the University of Oxford. And that is a leadership position of an incredible institution that has a huge impact on the thinking and training of young people around the world, as well as producing ideas. Before that, she was the principal and vice-chancellor of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and was the first person, the first woman ever to serve as the head of the Carnegie Corporation. She's, as I say, an extraordinary intellectual leader in the field of terrorism and conflict, having spent 20 years at Harvard after getting her original degree in history from Trinity College in Ireland, and then a master's degree in political science from the University of California, and then followed with an MA and PhD from Harvard. She's leading an institution which has been one of the most consequential, I think, philanthropic institutions in American history, particularly in the field of what we do here, academic studies, and also the incredible work they do in libraries. Which is, for those of us, I grew up in a small town in southeastern Massachusetts, Brockton, Massachusetts, which actually had the first Carnegie Library in America. So it's something for me, and I've been very, very conscious all through my life about that. But I have had the personal privilege of being involved in working with the Carnegie Corporation for a long time. Two of the most extraordinary mentors that I've had in my life were David Hamburg and Barton Gregorian. And the two of them, who were immense leaders in their field, had an impact both as individuals, but also leading a philanthropic institution which has made an impact in so many different fields, but especially in the field that we all work in here in international affairs. And I have to say, I've been honored and privileged for over 2 decades to have been able to work with people at the Carnegie, and my good friend and colleague Steve Del Russo is here with us today, who's been an amazing force in helping to support the work that so many of us do. So thanks to Carnegie and to Steve, and now to Dame Louise Richardson for all the tremendous support that Carnegie has given so many of us over the years. And I think it's a really consequential time for institutions like Carnegie as we think about how do we sustain a set of principles and concerns that she has been so influential in talking about, which is the whole issue of freedom of discourse in the academy, and the opportunity to continue to be a force where people can express conflicting views and debate ideas, sometimes very difficult and challenging ideas, in a civilized way that both allows for the diversity of thought, but also recognizes that these are difficult conversations. And at Oxford in particular, she's been a leader in articulating some of those issues, and I know that's going to be an important part of the work that she does at Carnegie as well. And as I said, I want to thank Shirin Tahir-Kheli, who has been the force of nature behind the series since it started. She is senior fellow and founding director of our South Asia program at the Foreign Policy Institute here at SAIS, and has been a research professor in international relations But before that, she had a very distinguished career as a diplomat under Secretary Rice and during President Bush's administration. She served from 2003 to 2005 as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations at the NSC. And then she moved over to work as the key U.S. official on U.S. policy on UN reform, which is a big issue today. And I know that she's probably aware that our ambassador to the UN is actually in East Asia now talking about UN reform with the governments of South Korea and Japan. She was appointed by Secretary Rice as her senior advisor for women's empowerment in 2006. Is the first individual to be appointed to that position. I think it's a tribute to Secretary Rice and to Ambassador Tahir-Kheli that this position was created because we have a tremendous need for it. And I know during my time serving under Secretary Clinton, we followed very much in the footsteps of the pioneering work that you did, and my colleagues there were grateful for your establishing that position. So I want you to join me in welcoming Louise Richardson to the podium. She's going to talk for a few minutes with us, and then we're going to have a conversation between the ambassador and our new president of Parliament. Thank you all for being with us.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for those kind words of welcome. It's a real pleasure to speak in a series named for Condoleezza Rice, who served as a member of the Advisory Council to the Carnegie Corporation's Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, and later as with Ambassador Shirin, she served on the board of the Carnegie Corporation. Our links to John Hopkins go back much further. The first grant I could find dates to 1923, when we gave a gift of $1.1 million at the time, and $1.1 million was a lot of money, to endow the medical school. Since then, there have been about 17 million in grants to SAIS, which certainly speaks to our long-standing relationship, but I appreciate it's a drop in the bucket when compared to the research funding of Johns Hopkins. And I would like to congratulate Johns Hopkins for its for the 44th consecutive year topping the country in research spending by the university, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. Andrew Carnegie himself, who never attended university, fully understood the needs. He once wrote, "If any millionaire is at a loss to know how to accomplish great and indisputable good with its surface, here is a field that can never be fully occupied. For the wants of our university increase with the development of the country." Now, when I was running universities, I used to suggest we carve this particular quote over the entrance to investment banks and hedge fund offices. Now, this evening I was asked to speak about removing the barriers between scholarship and policy making. So I thought I would, first of all, speak about the history of so-called useless knowledge and its association with universities. Second, tell you about the Bridging the Gap program that's been running at Carnegie since 2006 and is designed specifically to dismantle these barriers. And third, tell you what I think are the two biggest barriers, one from each from the supply and demand side, and what we might do about them. First, on the history, the term ivory tower has been synonymous with universities for a very long time. And in anticipation of this talk, I realized I didn't quite know where it came from. So turns out in the Odyssey, you had the gates of horn and ivory. Dreams coming from the former are true prophecy. Dreams coming from the ivory gate may be pleasant, but are not directly useful. So it may actually be more classically correct to say that academics live behind the ivory gates. Anyway, in medieval times, the ivory tower became a symbol of the Virgin Mary's purity and nobility based on the Song of Songs. The modern usage dates back to the French literary critic Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve, who used it to contrast the unworldly poet Alfred de Vigny with a much more socially conscious Victor Hugo. Popularized in English by Henry James's last novel, The Ivory Tower, which combines mockery of an absent-minded savant and admiration of someone who's able to devote their entire efforts to a noble cause. Since the 1930s, the various towers and spires of Oxford and Cambridge have been called the ivory towers, though in truth there's more ivy than ivory in them. And I'm told that the tower of the Graduate College in Princeton is nicknamed the Ivory Tower in reference to the donor, William Cooper Proctor, who made his fortune on ivory soap. Now, whether academia is useful has been debated for as long as there have been universities. And the Edinburgh Review criticised the moribund universities of Oxford and Cambridge in the 1810s. Foremost amongst the criticism was that by focusing on classics, logic, and mathematics, both students and scholars were discouraged from studying more socially useful subjects, and Adam Smith was held up as a more positive example of useful knowledge. One spectacular example of an 18th century academic bridging the gap, possibly even more influential than Adam Smith, is the lawyer and jurist William Blackstone. He was the first Venerian professor of common law at Oxford. Prior to 1755, all law taught at universities and colleges was either civil law, that is to say Roman law, or canon law, church law. The Venerian was the first professorship of common or customary law anywhere in Europe or the Americas. Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England became the standard textbook, not only in England, but also in the colonies and the American colonies and later the US, where extensive law libraries were in short supply. Blackstone set out all the precedent needed in one place, elegantly organized and clearly written. The commentaries are by far the most cited work in the history of the Supreme Court, aside from the Bible. Blackstone also added as an appendix a plan for the ideal law school. This was never adopted in England, but became the foundation of law schools at American universities. Now, I should, of course, point out that medics have never had any difficulty bridging the gap between academia and policy, certainly not since 1310, when Oxford's John of Gaddesden published Rosa Angelica, Britain's earliest surviving medical textbook, or 1628, when Professor William Harvey published his treatise on the circulation of the blood. Indeed, during the recent pandemic, I did some research on how Oxford had responded to past plagues, because there were a large number of plagues in the 16th century. And I found that the advice proffered by the 17th century Professor Hodges was extraordinarily similar to the regimes that we followed in lockdown. Isolation, no social interaction. The only two differences were, in those days, domestic animals all had to be killed because it was assumed they were carriers. And secondly, people were allowed to congregate in churches. Anyway, my focus is not on medics, but on the social sciences, and particularly foreign policy, as is appropriate for the School of Advanced International Studies. As I mentioned, in 2006, the Carnegie Corporation launched a program called Bridging the Gap, precisely to try to remove the barriers between scholarship and foreign policy making. The term itself was coined by Alexander George. And I'm happy to see that my colleague, Dr. Steve Del Rosso, who has led this initiative since some days, is here in the audience. If you have any complaints, you can direct them to him. Now, the corporation has provided $33.5 million in grants to professional networks, training, publication opportunities, research, and fellowships that place academics in government roles. As of last year, we had 480 alumni who are well represented in academia and at government agencies, State Department, Defense Department, and the White House. Now, the program is based on the belief, as articulated by Steve, that good policy is informed by good ideas. Good ideas are not formed in a vacuum. We felt it to be particularly important at a moment in philanthropy when a number of our peers are moving away from support of academic research in favor of advocacy, that we support academics in their quest for insight and new ideas. One example of a grant made through this program is the International Policy Scholars Consortium and Network, right here at SAIS. The program trains scholars in the art of conducting statecraft. Since 2014, the program has received $2.8 million in support from Carnegie and trained over 100 PhD students from a number of different disciplines. Each year, 15 PhD candidates participate in a summer retreat at Syracuse University, monthly video conference seminars, and a 2-day scenario-based workshop here in Washington. They're mentored by senior academics from a dozen universities, including those who have served in high-ranking foreign policy positions in both Democratic and Republican administrations. This way, participants build professional networks of scholars and gain familiarity with the workings of foreign policy making inside the Beltway. We commissioned a review of our program last year, and I commended this review to you. It provides detailed case studies and concludes with 5 recommendations. First, invest in public-facing tools and platforms for dissemination. Second, prioritize and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Third, encourage changes in academic incentives to support policy-relevant scholarship. Fourth, establish a set of ethics and best practices. And fifth, convene funders across academic disciplines and areas of study. Now, by providing support for policy-relevant work, we're not for a moment denigrating curiosity-driven research, which belongs in every university worthy of the name. We can all cite examples from radios to electricity to computers being invented by academics with no thought to their practical application. In social sciences, too, Carnegie has supported research that was ahead of its time. A classic example here is our support for Gunnar Myrdal's work that became his famous book, An American Dilemma, published in 1944. The book remained on the shelf largely unnoticed until 1954, when it became the intellectual foundation for the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision. More recently, another example, when the Arab Spring emerged, the 100 Carnegie scholars focused on Islam suddenly became the intellectual group the media turned to for help in understanding what was happening. Now, my personal view is that the biggest impediment to interchange between scholarship and policymaking on the supply side is the promotion criteria used in academic departments. On the demand side, the biggest impediment is the polarization that is overtaking our politics. On the supply side, while public policy schools are making progress in incorporating policy-relevant factors into their tenure and promotion decisions, the same cannot be said of political science departments. They remain tied to long-standing disciplinary norms and practices. Theoretical, peer-reviewed work published in highly specialized journals is highly valued and heavily weighted. Policy-relevant work is not. Until this changes, we are not going to get ambitious young academics devoting a significant proportion of their time to policy-relevant work. Michael Dash has referred to this as the cult of the irrelevant. Now, the post-war generation of political scientists, many like my mentor, the late great Stanley Hoffman, were refugees from Europe and were motivated by a desire to understand the catastrophe that had befallen the continent and a determination to ensure that it would never happen again. They were succeeded by a generation more wedded to theory and methods than praxis and politics. My own experience is illustrative in this regard. As a junior faculty member in the 1990s, I worked on terrorism. I was advised by a senior colleague to drop it. He told me to continue was, and I quote, academic suicide. There are no theoretical underpinnings. When it came to teaching notes, my 170 student lecture course counted the same as a colleague who taught a 2-student seminar on a statistical method. I was told that the fact that my courses were large and popular meant that I wasn't serious. At the same time, I was visited annually by someone from the State Department Counterterrorism Unit, who expressed frustration to me that I wasn't focused on ways to capture the terrorists. As a response to these visits, I actually gave a paper at the APSA, I think it was in about 2000, titled Mind the Gap, arguing that academics must be free to do the work they care about, whether or not it is immediately useful to government. After 9/11, of course, the whole world of terrorism scholarship changed. When the attack occurred, the administration did reach out to terrorism scholars. At the time, there were very few of us, scattered in universities across the country. The administration brought us together and we proffered advice. None of it was followed. Instead, vast amounts of money was made. Academics, mainly drawn from those who'd studied the Cold War, rushed to declare themselves experts and offered the type of advice the administration wanted to hear. The rest, as tragically we know, is history. The lesson, it seems to me, is that we should broaden the criteria used for adjudicating the merits of academic work. The second point is to bear in mind that the advice offered by academics may not always be the best advice. Just think of the Iraq War and the Vietnam War. The third point is that academics must be independent of government too, not merely hired hands to do research on the government's priorities, but free to do their own research, which may or may not in time prove to be useful. Given that each university has its own promotion criteria, though they are remarkably uniform, how do you go about changing this? One small example is the Oxford University Press series begun by Carnegie's Bridging the Gap project to get policy-relevant work published by the elite presses. The United Kingdom provides an example of a much larger scale intervention, which has had a dramatic impact on UK higher education. The REF, Research Excellence Framework, is a national effort to measure the level of excellence across universities and academic departments. It takes place every 7 years, and participation is essentially compulsory as it's tied to the major source of funding for research. Government funding for research, that is. 60% of the score goes to the quality and proportion of excellent research, as measured by peer review, 15% to environment, and 25% for impact, up from 20% in the previous round. Impact is assessed with case studies of individual projects and a demonstration of a department's overall impact. The REF has transformed the academic prospects of young academics doing policy-relevant work, has caused all academics and departments to think about how their work might have impact, and more than anything, has largely eradicated the notion, still prevalent in American universities, that applied work is somehow second-rate. Now, it's hard to see how a similar mechanism could be introduced in the US, but given the interest in rankings, it would be interesting to see if some of the rankings could try to incorporate a measure of impact into their metrics. The British case does show that a culture, even an academic culture, can actually change. On the demand side, I see the biggest impediment to removing the barriers between scholarship and policymaking as the polarization that has overtaken American politics in recent years. Faith in universities has been declining, as faith in all institutions and in democracy generally has declined. Universities are increasingly being dragged into the culture wars, and all advice emanating from universities likely to be seen through an ideological prism. Expertise itself is being downgraded and denigrated. Universities are increasingly being seen as conservative free zones, and university faculty believed to be imposing a liberal ideology on their students. As voting tendency is ever more closely linked to degree of educational attainment, universities will increasingly be linked to one side in a binary conflict. In this environment, barriers are likely to be reinforced rather than reduced. So what is to be done? At Carnegie, we're making a major effort to address the crisis of polarization. Earlier this week, we selected the first cohort of 28 Carnegie Fellows from over 360 nominations, who will each receive $200,000 over 2 years as they conduct research on how to understand political polarization in the US and how to mitigate it. We hope in this way to mine academia for ideas that will then influence our grant making and help to build forces of social cohesion. In addition to this, we're using polarization as a lens through which to see all our grant making and adjusting accordingly. In education, for example, we're providing funding for civics teaching, and our democracy program is funding community service initiatives in both red and blue states. We're also funding polarization labs in a number of universities. In addition, I think we can all make a concerted effort to make the case for expertise. In the biggest global challenge of recent times, the COVID pandemic, Expertise, much of it emanating from universities, saved millions upon millions of lives. We must not let people forget that. Much of the expertise came from the medical world. The scientists who developed the vaccine were, of course, critical. But so too were those who advised on how to distribute it, both domestically and internationally. I'm most familiar with the UK experience, but there the Medicine and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, who decided to extend the recommended interval between COVID vaccinations from 3 to 12 weeks, which at the time was a very controversial decision, was estimated to have saved 10,000 lives in the UK alone. Medical research of all kinds, especially epidemiologists such as Michael Osterholm in the US, Niall Ferguson in the UK, Anders Tengel in Sweden, became enormously influential, both in giving advice on the likely course of the pandemic to government, but also in explaining it directly to the public on television. In the UK, the Scientific Pandemic Insights Group on Behaviour, a group of behavioural scientists, advised the government on whether and for how long lockdown measures would be tolerated by the general public, and on the likely impact of various mitigation measures. There are probably a good many doctoral dissertations being written on the extent to which the public, as was found worldwide, were more obedient than anybody expected. Experts in behavioral science are now being added to the international negotiating body of the World Health Organization to plan for future pandemic response. The political scientists of the Radcliffe School of Government in Oxford produced the Pandemic Response Tracker, which enabled easy international comparisons between response measures and their impact. For 3 years, it covered 190 countries, plus every state in the US and every province in China, with 1,500 citizen scientists collecting data on 23 different types of pandemic measures. As well as providing a huge data set for future research, the tracker was cited across the Western world in contemporary debates about intensifying or relaxing COVID-related controls, a field in which there was a great deal of misinformation circulating. And finally, I can't help pointing out that it was a university that produced and distributed a vaccine at cost. By the end of 2021, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was calculated to have saved 6.3 million lives, more than any other vaccine, and was distributed across the world and is continuing to be distributed throughout the developing world at cost. I think in closing that I'd like to make a call on foundations, universities, think tanks, all to make the case for expertise in the service of the public good. We must demonstrate that our expertise is dispassionate, evidence-based, non-ideological, and useful. We should also demonstrate our commitment to sound public policy by insisting on a revision to academic criteria for promotion. It's only in so doing that we have any hope of removing the barriers between scholarship and policymaking in this hyper-polarized political environment. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to add my welcome to the Dean for your presence here and on this very, very important and interesting topic. This, your life has reflected so many important sort of strains that I'm trying to keep the conversation concise because I'd like to allow time for any questions that the audience has before we break up. But a couple of things that sort of came to me as you were making your remarks, and also from reading of your really amazing remarks at King's College in London, where you talked about the role of universities, how I think you said it's like a rainforest, it's a place where a lot of nurturing takes place and growth in a productive fashion occurs, and the consequences can be amazing as the rainforest, beautiful and so on. And in some of your later remarks, particularly your exchange with at Harvard, it was just not that long ago with Radcliffe, you talked about the complications that occur as universities play out this role of being nurturers of talent, suppliers of policymakers in this world of polarization where it becomes difficult to bridge the gap, even though we know it needs to be bridged. So how does one reconcile what's current? Because in an ideal situation, you have scholarship that is encouraged to be relevant and no penalties for making it policy relevant. I remember that as a real put down. Well, so-and-so does policy related work. I mean, it's not theoretical, it just doesn't build on the body of political science, etc. But even in a receptive government atmosphere, one assumes that the institutions are neutral, that good scholars can find good positions based on good work. But the polarization aspect, has that changed the receptivity for scholarship as making a difference in policy?
Well, I think it will make it increasingly difficult because I think, let's face it, this is a very difficult time for universities, and it's a very good time, no longer to be the university president, I have to say. But I think the opinion polling on this is really very sobering. The degree to which people distrust universities now and believe that they're leaving aside the Gaza issue, but believe that they are inhospitable places for conservatism, and that conservatives are, and I think we have to admit that the conservatives are underrepresented amongst academia. And so the problem is if that becomes the view of universities, if they're essentially associated with one ideological perspective, that will make it much more difficult for their views to be accepted as legitimate. So I think it's really incumbent upon us to ensure that we are dispassionate and evidence-based. And the metaphor I was using of the rainforest, I mean, the rainforests thrive on diversity, and I think universities need far more ideological diversity than we currently have. But also, rainforests suck toxins out of the air, neutralize them, which I think universities can do. And I'm quite an idealist when it comes to the potential of universities to address most of our problems, and not that they always have, but have the potential to do so. But I think it is becoming more difficult in this polarized time. Absolutely.
So there's in the project that you're sort of undertaking through Carnegie to find ways to bridge this gap. Are you looking at both the supply side, where the scholars being produced represent a variety of different backgrounds, intellectual backgrounds, as well as the receptivity side of the equation, where they will find a comfort zone? I mean, right now, and you get the sense that this talk of radical sweep between administrations, and just given in the US, based on what your credentials are. How do you deal with that sort of thinking?
Well, I think this kind of Manichaean view of the world that is this black and white view of the world that is symptomatic of polarization is just antithetical to what universities must stand for. I think it's the very term university derives from the Latin universitatis, meaning all. It's about having all ideas, all perspectives, all engaging with one another, and that's what education is all about. And I think we've lost sight of that in recent years, and we have to return to our core activity, which is having a wide range of ideas, all ideas that are evidence-based or reasonably argued and welcome.
Certainly this in the US, in the past and present, at least for the moment, there's always the possibility of a turnover. You get with the dean who know, and those of us who've been in and out of the system, that academics get a chance to be in the policy role, then you go out, and then you get sort of may go back, may not go back. It's fairly atypical, I think, this system. I don't know whether they're corresponding to this degree even in the UK.
No, not at all.
Because I think they're more sort of, the academic track versus the.
That's true. I mean, increasingly in Britain, they are bringing in scientific advisors, for example, from every university, or in every department, and even sub-departments, and they are academics, and they come in for this particular role, but you don't have the degree of movement in and out that you have here.
Does that help you with the bridging the polarization gap?
Well, I don't think polarization is anything like as acute in Britain as it is here. And that's an interesting point because actually, I think prior to the pandemic, Britain was a very polarized country as evidenced by the national act of self-harm, which was Brexit. And after the pandemic, Britain was much less polarized, whereas I think over the past several years, you've had an accelerating pace of polarization in this country. And I think, I have no evidence for this, but my hunch is that the reason for this is there are unifying institutions in Britain. You have the BBC, for example, which people on the right and people on the left criticize, but it is the one trusted source of news for everybody in the country. And at 6 o'clock every day throughout the pandemic, everybody turned on the TV to watch 6 o'clock and find out what was happening with the pandemic. The other unifying institution in Britain that is absent here is the National Health Service. And it really was creaking. It is creaking. It seems it was really put under enormous pressure during the pandemic because it's chronically underfunded. But the entire country came, the whole mantra was help the NHS, help you. They couldn't cope with the number of volunteers that they had administering vaccines, running vaccine centers, and so on. So there was a real sense of coming together around this institution to help get the country through this. And I can't think of any unifying institutions in this. I mean, the presidency obviously should be one, and one can imagine a couple of institutions we could all name them that ought to have this function in this country, but there aren't any corollaries of the NHS or the BBC, which may be one of the reasons that the pace has accelerated here so much.
The experience is different because here, even the discussion when we're all in the throes of the pre-vaccine and post-vaccine was not very uniform. I mean, when people came forward, but they came forward on different sides of the divide. I mean, we have a presidential candidate now running who's one of his major platforms was that he was an anti-vaxxer. So it's a different kind of experience, but I guess there are many more universities here, and there are many more. I mean, it's a larger system. Maybe that is part of the sort of difference, because as you talk about universities being open places where discussions, civilized disagreement, or at least civil discourse is present, and everybody gets a chance to be heard, and there's some resolution. Would you say that sort of represents the current political, educational environment? I mean, it's
well, no,
and how do we get back to that?
That's the tricky thing. How do you get there? Yeah. Look, I think every university needs to have a conversation and about their commitment to freedom of speech. Certainly, when I arrived at Oxford, I convened a group of academics to help us draw up a statement of freedom of speech. And we posted that in the first page of the university website. And there, Timothy Gordon-Ash, my colleague, called it an atmosphere of robust civility. Is what we aspire to. And so once you have that statement front and center, then the policies follow from that. And in addition, every student at Oxford matriculated went through a formal ceremony of matriculation, dressed in academic robes, went to the Shadowland Theatre. So it's big day when they formally become students at the university. And every one of them, graduate, undergraduate, professional school, all had to endure a speech from me. And I had to do it about a dozen times because there were so many. But in any event, but it was the same speech. And it said, you know, this is a place which values ideas and exchange of ideas. And you are going to hear ideas that you don't like, and you do not have a right and not to be offended. That is not a right we see in this community. But you do have a right to express your ideas. And you know, I exhorted them to follow the Augustinian precept, audi alterum partem, listen to the other side. I mean, try to change the mind of somebody who disagrees with you, but above all, be open to having your own mind change. So I think right at the beginning, you have to establish the norms of behavior. And I think very few American universities, let's face it, have done that, which is part of the reason I think they found themselves in the difficulties they're currently in. So it will be difficult to go back. But as so often happens, so many universities are in crisis at the moment. It takes a crisis, I think, to allow for a radical shift. I think we probably need a fairly radical shift back to the core of what we're about.
Right, I mean, getting them to sign on to it right at the start, but remembering it when the temperatures get hot, and that you know, because we've had this inviting of speakers and all sorts of things going on.
You see, we were absolutely adamant that, and it's a very difficult position to maintain. Nobody could disinvite anybody, but I mean, this got me into difficulty with both the government, which introduced what they call the prevent legislation, anti-terrorism legislation, which prohibited the expression of speech antithetical to British values. So I lobbied hard against that. I failed, the law passed, so we abided by it. But I argued that it's precisely at a university that those views should be expressed, so long as they're expressed openly and challenged openly, not in some, you know, to a small group of zealous adherents. And so on the one hand, you're criticized by the right for doing it. On the other hand, you're criticized on the left for insisting on that they couldn't.
Well, then you've done something right if everybody's criticizing.
Yeah, it's not a terribly comfortable place, but yes.
I know that we have lots of issues, but I just want to raise one before I turn it over for questions. And this goes to your earlier sort of career where we looked at terrorism and counterterrorism. And you've looked at it actually from the very sort of beginning, when it wasn't even considered a serious, as you said, line of thinking. Has it changed? Has it morphed into something different, terrorism and counterterrorism today, from your sort of perspective as you've looked at it long term?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I with some colleagues, I wrote a book called Democracy and Counterterrorism. And one of the lessons from that book is that countries tragically, never learn from the mistakes of other countries. They proceed to repeat the same mistakes as the US has done. But countries do learn from their own mistakes, as the US has done. So I do think US.
In what sense? I mean,
we recently heard President Biden say to Prime Minister Netanyahu, you know, don't make the mistakes we made. So I think there was a tendency to treat all, right after 9/11, all Muslims as suspect, for example, rather than appreciating that, you know, your best possible source of intelligence are the loyal communities in which the bad guys operate. So our counterterrorism policy now is so much more sophisticated and nuanced than it was. And I think, this is true of your governments generally, and of Britain over time. Obviously, their counterterrorism operation in Northern Ireland became very sophisticated and very effective. Initially, all it did was produce more terrorists.
Interesting, thank you. Well, I want to open up for questions from our audience. Please identify yourself and let us know if you're a student. Are there any questions out there? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Giovanna Becker. I am not a student. I came from New York City. I'm involved with the International Peace Institute and hopefully in the future with the UNESCO. I want to thank you so much for what you said. That brought to mind a sentence, a speech given by McLeish, the poet, the lawyer, and the statesman. He said, freedom to speak, freedom of speech is also freedom to hear, but it's freedom to hear the pleasant situation as well as the inconvenient situation. And he was talking about the relationship between universities and the government, which, as you said, has been going on for long time, and it has been on a roller coaster for such a long time. So freedom to speech is freedom to hear the good and the bad. So maybe from the academics side, I'm thinking perhaps it's a new marketing strategy of the university itself that is needed as a as a cultural diplomacy, for example, type of approach to create links and more bonds and to overcome this huge gap. Maybe, just an idea.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Alex Wright, and I'm an alum of SAIS. We've talked a lot about bridging the gap between academia and policymakers, but I'm curious what Carnegie is doing to bridge the gap and advise and train policymakers to bridge that gap between them and lawmakers within the polarization of today's politics. How are we training policymakers, for example, in government, to use the knowledge they're receiving, to use the frameworks, the processes, the programmatic understanding that they're receiving, to then deal with pushback from our political polarization, from that gap that then exists between policymakers and lawmakers, and I use those terms specifically. Curious what Carnegie's doing to help in that endeavor.
Well, I'm happy to have Steve step in here if you'd like, but what we do, which is most proximate to what you're describing, is we fund a number of initiatives, mainly run by the Aspen Institute, but others as well, to educate congresspeople, senators, congressmen, and staffers about the world. So we fund that a lot. We introduce them to policymakers. We have these several day sessions where they have, kind of immersive sessions where they hear from policymakers on a particular issue. We also have a raft of, again, we're doing this all through others. A number of think tanks in this town run programs that we help fund for to educate more the politicians than the policymakers per se. But that's as close, I think, as we get to doing what you're suggesting.
I'm Nat Ahrens, the Executive Director of the American Mandarin Society and also a fellow here at the Foreign Policy Institute. And I want to ask you about impact, which you raised earlier on. And the context for that is I worked on a multi-year program here at FPI with the Ford Foundation, looking at the question of why are think tanks, universities so poor at dealing with long-term entrenched transnational policy challenges. And one of the issues that came up when we're looking, especially at think tanks, but also at universities, is as soon as you start to measure impact, which is a big thing here in Washington already, you've got to measure that somehow. And it tends to be website hits, how many times you get mentioned in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and that leads people to focus more on what happened yesterday, what happened today, what is the big Chinese cleanliness coming up in a week, and it takes you away from some of the more important questions, just to focus on how can I get my name out there, how can we get hits right now. So do you have ideas on how you can better measure or encourage the right kind of impact?
Thank you. It's a great question, and it's a very difficult one that everybody in foundations thinks about all the time, a lot of the time. And I would go back to the discussions held in Britain about this, because the government has taken this extremely seriously. All universities in the UK are government funded. So they care a great deal. They want to have impact for their for the money they're spending on universities. So in the initial round, impact was essentially assessed as misconstrued as engagement. So people responded. They done the first time, and it was the RAE wanted to assess impact. People said, you know, yes, I got quoted 6 times, and I had 500 school children come to a lecture I gave, or whatever. And nobody felt that this was terribly satisfactory. The next iteration, that was too easy. The next one was too difficult. So academics would have to get policymakers, a letter from policymaker to say, I changed the policy on X because of Professor Y. And that's really pretty hard to do. We still don't have it completely right, but what they're doing in the most recent iteration, where, as I say, it was 25% of your score. This is, you know, tens of millions of pounds of research funding over 7 years. So it really matters. So for every 10 peer-reviewed works that were submitted, there had to be a case study that demonstrated impact. So it didn't mean everybody had to be doing something that they could demonstrate they changed policy or changed the way something was done. But for every 10 journal articles, there had to be one. And this was true of the humanities as well. And what that led to was you know, historians going around to the country houses of England and doing research and uncovering all sorts of fascinating things that were unknown, like, say, I don't know, gay life in the 16th century, that, you know, that had just never been considered or covered, and yet it turns out there was all sorts of information about it that led to a massive increase in communities who had hitherto felt pretty disengaged from these country houses, wanting to know more about them and engaging with them. So that was historians, so, you know, not at the forefront of policy impact, but it's very difficult. But yeah, and the government and academics have been working very hard on it for, you know, several rounds now. And the optimum was to be able to show you change policy, of course, or improve relations between states by breaking down misunderstandings and so on. But it's not. It's hard to make that happen in some fields.
Yeah,
In
absolutely.
particular. In the US, you have this tradition of, you know, we got policy planning staff in the State Department, which has, I think 50% are usually academics coming in. So there's a rotation in other institutions, but I think it's unique over here.
I think Steve has heard me say, look, we're the largest private funder of work on US-China relations, the largest private funder of work on US-Russia relations, the largest private funder of nuclear security. All three are worse than they've been for decades. So, you know, what are we doing? I mean, it is something we worry about.
We just know too much about them because of your funding, and therefore we can measure. Any other questions out there? Yes, Edward.
Hi, my name is Ray Davis. I came from Towson, Maryland. I'm in the world of academia. And I would, first of all, thank you. I thought it was a brilliant conversation. I think you covered a lot of ground in history. And I also want some of the students to ask some questions because it's your world now, literally. And we need you guys more than ever. So I encourage you all. I wanted to address political polarization, which you mentioned many times. And real quickly, there was a major shift in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher. Reagan's quote was, government is not the solution, it's a problem. Thatcher was, from the school of Ayn Rand, there is no society. Austerity economics took over. So let's fast forward to Claudine Gay, president of Harvard, being forced to step down. And it was really one billionaire donor that pushed that issue. I I agree 100% that universities have a liberal bent to them. I don't think that's a negative thing, however. But in America right now, private companies, as you probably know, are buying up everything. They're buying up hospitals. They're in the mortgage industry big time, which is inflating the cost of everything. And the last point is, no one in America, the richest country in the history of the world, should be paying a mortgage to go to a college or university, especially considering our military adventures overseas. So I gave you a lot, so whatever you want to tap, but I really appreciate you. You know, you covered a lot of history, a lot of ground, and pertinent information, so thank you. And college students, please answer questions.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, I agree with much of what you say. You know, I've spent many years in Massachusetts, where a classic tragic example of what you just described, where venture capitalists came in and bought a healthcare system and have made a fortune and driven it into bankruptcy. The Stewart system in Western Massachusetts tragically is now collapsing, and yet some people walked away with a lot of money. I think it is a problem if not if universities have a liberal bent. I think the nature of the professions, they will always have a liberal bent, but actually a true liberal wants to engage with people who disagree. So I think it is imperative that we now have an orthodoxy and liberal bent. I have no problem. I couldn't agree more with your point about the cost of higher education in this country. I mean, it's astounding. The way it works in Britain is that nobody pays anything upfront, and the cost is £9,250, and the government pays it, and then the student pays that back over the course of their career, but nobody has to pay anything upfront. In Scotland, university education is completely free if you're Scottish. Interestingly enough, when I was at Harvard, I used to argue that Harvard was rich enough that what they really ought to do was make tuition free. And I said, we've got the best fundraising machine in the world. Why not make tuition free? Think of the message that would send to every kid in the country, thinking all I've got to do is work hard enough to get in and never have to worry about the cost. And I said, you know, and then this fantastic fundraising machine could pursue those who were in, who had the means to pay. Anyway, we know how that went down. But I then went to Scotland, where university education is free. And actually, the number of poor kids going to university, the percentage is lower than in England, where, again, nobody has to put any money up front, but you do have to incur debts. And if you're from a poor background, you're pretty reluctant to incur debts because you don't have the confidence that you'll be able to repay them. I mean, I know this personally. Which is just to say there are many problems you didn't mention, which is the inequality and social deprivation long before it becomes time to make a competitive application to a top university, which is one of the things we at Carnegie have been trying for decades and decades to do to improve the public education system in this country. It's not quite as bad as relations with China and Russia, but it's nowhere close to where it should be in a country as wealthy as this. Thank you. Right at the back.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I agree you've covered a lot of ground, and so I have, I guess, two different questions for you. I am an alumna from Johns Hopkins. I did my PhD here, and I work now at George Washington University, where I direct the Foreign Area Officers Program. I also spent a year working at the State Department through the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, which I'm sure you know, it's part of the sort of, it's similar to the Bridging the Gap initiative that places academics in government for a year.
We funded.
Right. So my question is, have you looked at, you know, it's one thing to bring academics into government, and if you go to at least here in the United States, the government say, we'll give you, you know, an expert with, you know, free labor basically for a year. I mean, who would turn that down, right? But the question is, I guess, to what extent are they willing to learn from that expertise? And so I don't know if you've thought about how to, or if you've thought about ways to sort of, because I think the issue is not just polarization in government, right? But it's also in some ways a willingness to actually be open to new ideas. And sometimes, you know, the new ideas have to be bold ideas, major changes. And in other cases, it's more like tweaking or implementing. For example, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is now a law in the United States, but the question is, how do you implement it? So sometimes, I guess the question is, how have you looked at ways to ensure that those new ideas, whether they're big ideas or more on the implementation level, are to what extent the government is actually receptive to that? And perhaps you have different experience in the UK that you could also, you know, elaborate on. Thank you.
The UK, I think, is very different. It's a much smaller community, and there's no doubt academics really can have influence. In the heyday, I think, was during the pandemic, where, you know, teams of experts were to a large extent guiding government policy. They didn't always agree. In fact, there were, you know, an alternate group of academic experts set themselves up to challenge the official one and so on. But again, so you had rivaling ideas, which was completely constructive and welcomed. I don't know if it would be possible to do what you're saying, because it's the government isn't one entity, it's a massive bureaucracy. And I think depending on the individuals in leadership in any sections of that bureaucracy, they would be more or less open to new ideas. I think there are probably several people in the room. Given your experience, you may well be one of them, and certainly I know I'm sitting next to another who could speak much more knowledgeably to that as to how do you encourage receptivity to the ideas academics are coming in. I don't believe we've ever tested it. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, Dame. I'm Thomas. I'm from Canada, so my question is on the Westminster system. So for those who don't know, our policymakers come from elected officials, and I see the world becoming increasingly complex. And this leads our elected officials to have exquisite political skills, but sometimes not have a deep knowledge of the area that they'll be asked to make decisions about, whether that be defense, intelligence, the economy, science. How do you see the Westminster system really adapting to the rise of technology and the fact that policymakers might be political animals, but might not be equipped to take decisions in the field that they've been assigned to?
Thank you. Well, you know, the reason the British system has been as successful as it has is really because of the professional civil service in Britain. There's a very highly respected civil service in Britain. And it's not a very well-paid job, but the smartest kids out of university want to go into the civil service, and it's a very, very career. It's completely different from here. So they have a system for college graduates, for example, where you're put in a 2-year system where you spend 6 months each in different departments and decide which one you want to spend more time in. And that's the beginning of your career. But throughout your career, you move through different departments. So you have real expertise in implementing policy, and they have a real status. They're completely non-political. So right now, the civil service is planning for a Labour government in Britain. The expectation is that Labour will be the next government. So you have this professional civil service anticipating that there will be very different policy decisions made, and they're now getting ready to implement them. So I think the system works on having a professional civil service. And again, they in turn bring in technology experts, and there are sections which just attract technology experts, but they manage to recruit people and have them stay for an entire career, because it ends up being a very interesting career. And you get to really influence policy. Thank you. Any others? Thank you so much. We are grateful for your comments, for all the wonderful things you've done over time, and we are the beneficiaries. And I want to convey thanks from Condoleezza Rice for being one of the speakers for this lecture series. And thank you to the audience, and especially to Steve for being here. It's good to see you again. We will reconnect some point. So thanks to the audience for being here, and we'll carry on to the next phase. Okay, thank you.